So I overheard this week, it was just as I was driving around, interesting NPR segment in which they were interviewing someone about a concept I had heard about but never really fully understand, a concept in social psychology called implicit bias. Has anybody ever heard of that phrase? Implicit bias. I found it very interesting because implicit bias, the idea of implicit bias, is that, we may carry around with us in some form or other kind of explicit biases and prejudices, though many of us hopefully have transformed or have transcended such explicit prejudices. But the point of the interview and the point of this study of what's called implicit bias is that actually we are so shaped by the culture and narratives of our society and culture that we subconsciously carry within us certain biases that we would have rejected as in a more explicit way. And the interesting idea here is that every single one of us, no matter how liberated or ideally we tend to think of ourselves, as not carrying any prejudices or stereotypes or any biases, still, because we are part of a culture, kind of have swam in this culture, kind of experienced in this culture certain biases that come out in some of the odd different ways. It's a very interesting idea, and they've done a number of different studies and research on this. A number of studies have found that white doctors sometimes have an implicit bias. It shows up when they give pain medicines, that they are more often or not to give, for the same kinds of symptoms, pain medicine to white patients than they are for African American males. The bias being that we assume that they can bear much more pain. And they do this without any kind of awareness. There are studies that show in job interviews, and they've done experiments and research which show that people who do job interviews, often more than not, respond much more favorably to male interviews than female, much more positively to names that seem to reflect a white culture rather than a black culture. And they would not even be aware of such biases. Another really interesting example, there was a study done in which they invited these 5-year-old kids in, and they told them and kind of gave them a story about a person. It wasn't gender specific, but about a person who was very smart and clever, and told this story. And then they were given 4 pictures, 2 men and 2 women. And they were asked which one of these 4 people could be that clever person. And what was interesting was that among the 5-year-olds, there was no statistical difference in who they picked out, male or female. A year later, they did the similar study. And what was interesting is now a year in which they're swimming in this culture, picking up these messages, these implicit ideas subconsciously, that when they did the same experiment, what was interesting is that the young girls, statistically different, were more often to pick a male as the clever person. We have these psychologists, social psychologists say, we have these implicit biases, these ideas that are kind of subtle, that we're not totally aware of yet somehow impact and reflect how we interact with the world and with others. And as I reflected on this, I have to reflect on my own life in moments in which I realize, and I like to think of myself as not a particularly racial person, not a particularly biased or prejudiced person, but instances in my own life I can reflect on in which this bias kind of entered my consciousness. One, I was driving with my teenage kids in the car. We pulled up to a stoplight. and right next to me pulled up a car filled with African-American teenagers. Rather rowdy group. And without thinking about it, I locked the doors. Much to the grief from my own kids who noticed. In particular, my African-American son, who made fun of me as much as he could. It was subconscious. It was just a bias, without reflection, without thinking. I remember a college party, Halloween party, dressed up in costumes, and I went with my girlfriend at the time, and she was dressed in scrubs. And I said, "What a great costume for a nurse." What did I do wrong there? She said, "I could have been a doctor." I don't think we had many dates after that. But there's a bias there, an implicit one that's subconscious, that in which I look at her not as a doctor, but as a nurse. I know when I married my wife, one of the things that she pointed out to me, and I never knew I did this, but I think it's so true, it was something I did automatically without thinking, that when we as a couple would meet a new couple, more often than not, I would ask what the husband did for a living and not ask the wife. I don't do that anymore. So we have, I think if we really reflect on our lives, those moments when we realize there's something kind of underneath our consciousness, some biases, some of the narratives, some of the stories, some of the ideas that we swim in the culture in which we live in. And one of the most powerful things about the gospel stories to me, one of the most powerful ways to interact with those gospel stories, those stories about Jesus, is over and over and over again. Almost every single Sunday, there is this story in which Jesus is challenging the implicit biases we carry within us. Last week, it was the Syrophoenician woman. The week before, it was Nicodemus, or the weeks before, Nicodemus, the elite. And just this morning, the story of a Samaritan woman. It always blows me away when I hear those who articulate or say that scriptures support their white nationalism or support their biases and prejudices, because to me it is so obvious. Story after story, it almost has to hit you between the eyes. How Jesus challenges, breaks down those implicit biases we carry within us, both implicit and explicit. If you read the Bible, the Gospels especially, you would see over and over that challenge. And our story this morning is just such a great example of that. Now, it's kind of hard for us to grasp. I mean, we hear of Jews and Samaritans. We really have no sense of the context for that. In fact, what's interesting is that John, when he writes his gospel, he has to explain to his audience. He says, well, you see, Jesus met this Samaritan woman, and he has this little parenthesis and says, well, and you should know Jews and Samaritans didn't hang out together. It was a lot more powerful than that. And the challenge as well, not only of this difference in religious, maybe we'd have an image, or maybe we might grasp somewhat the kind of scandal of this interaction between Jesus and the Samaritan woman by understanding her. Maybe we use the word Muslim and Christian, or Jew and Muslim. And the challenge that in his time they would have found it so scandalous that a man would address a woman outside his community. Not only address, but interact with. That it's really hard for us, we can't glimpse how challenging that story was to the implicit biases of Jesus' time. We really cannot grasp how scandalous that was. And part of the reason it was so scandalous is this encounter, I think, is actually playful. It's more like a comedy routine, like Abbott and Costello, who's on first. It's a playful interaction. Now, that's hard for us to imagine Jesus as playful. It may be one of the implicit biases we have, maybe by the centuries of time in which we've thought of Jesus as this pious and somber person. If you look around, most pictures we have of Jesus has him not being playful, but actually has him being rather somber and serious, right? Pious, centuries of accretion of these images of Jesus' divinity, that it makes him less than human. In fact, if you looked around at pictures you might find of Jesus, you would find it so incredibly rare to find one in which he's actually smiling. And this story is about a Jesus and this Samaritan woman that is playful and joyful. And it's kind of hard for us to interpret that story because we tend to hold this pious, somber attitude towards Jesus. But in fact, if one really delved into the story, one would capture the sense of that playfulness. He comes and asks water from her. She kind of replies cheekily, I can't give you water. You're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. And he kind of says, well, if you knew who was asking, you would find a living water. And she kind of playfully interacts with him. He says, well, where are you going to get this water? You don't have anything to lift it up. I mean, she's not intentionally being stupid. She's being funny and playful with him. What is this living water? Tell me about it. That way I don't have to keep coming to this well every day. So the interaction that's between Jesus and the Samaritan woman is one that's full of joy and possibility. And what that living water is, I'm convinced, is that very interaction itself. That she experienced in this conversation with Jesus, in this interaction with this Jesus, this experience of grace in which she was fully accepted. As a woman, as a Samaritan, she was fully embraced in who she was. Not because she deserved it, not because she was perfect. In the rest of the story, we find out she is imperfect. But because that's what we experience in Jesus, is this interaction and embrace of grace that overcomes all biases and all prejudice. It's interesting to me that later in the story, she goes back to her village and she tells the people. In many ways, she becomes the first evangelist, saying, I've met the Messiah. And why does she think he's the Messiah? She says something interesting, something we didn't read in our scripture. She says, because he knows me. He knows me. And how many men and how many persons of other ethnicities had she encountered who didn't really want to move beyond their biases, but really wanted to know her? The power of someone willing to know us and all our imperfections and all our identities, to really know us, is indeed living water. that overflows. You see, it's about the relationship. That's where the water flows. It's about relationships in which we're accepted and loved beyond those biases we're aware of and unaware of, in which people are embraced, not despite who they are, but because of who they are. There was a slave of a Roman senator about 200 years before the birth of Christ, really not quite 200 years. His name was Terence, not a household name. He was a famous slave because he wrote 6 plays that we still have around these days, 6 plays that he had written. And one of the most famous lines from one of those plays is one, I think, that's so profound now, still profound, still true 2,000 years, still wise 2,000 years later, is a line in which he says, "Nothing human is alien to me." Nothing human. I am human, in fact. And nothing human is alien to me. That's a motto Jesus lived by, exemplified, and a model in which we can go forth in the world. This summer, we have an opportunity, a number of people have an opportunity to go to El Salvador, to visit these communities. Part of what we're doing next week is celebrating this relationship, and many of us don't quite grasp what's special about this relationship with folks in El Salvador. For those who've gone, they can speak to this. The reality of the trip isn't us going there to do something for them. That isn't the purpose of the trip. The purpose of the trip is for us to actually know them. We actually, in the trip, you learn some of the history of El Salvador, but you learn, actually the way I describe it is that you go house to house and you sit down and you talk to these people and you know them. And they find that far more meaningful than any latrine which they appreciate, anything that we might do, what they crave. What we all crave, what every human being craves, is someone to care about them and know them. And to know you. There is, and I can't but describe it, there is powerful experience that we who live in this wealthy suburb here in Clive, Iowa, and West Des Moines and Des Moines, to go and know someone in these small communities, to connect to them and to know this truth. Nothing human is alien to us. And so I invite you, when you go and serve at the homeless shelter, that you go and interact with people around you, that you pay attention to the living water of grace that is present in any relationship. That you be aware of those moments in which our own explicit or implicit biases prevent us from really, really knowing that other human being. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.